Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf Ayin Zion. We are near the bottom of Ayin Vav Amabet. Let me share my screen and we will get started. Here we go. Yesterday, we began with a Mishnah that detailed that a broken leg bone can cause the leg beneath the breakage to be not kosher if there is insufficient flesh around the breakage. But if there's sufficient flesh, then not only the entire animal will be kosher because this is not going to cause, and even without the flesh, it's not going to cause the animal to become a treifa because it's only a breakage. The leg itself is not cut off, but when there's not enough flesh around it, so then what is below the break is as considered as if it's hanging and therefore not going to be kosher, even if the rest of the animal will be. And so, as we pick up today near the end of the 11th line from the bottom of Ayin Vav Amabet, the Gemara quotes a brisa that clarifies the meaning of sufficient flesh so that the leg will remain kosher. So, Tana Rabbanan, Nishbar ha'etzem v'yatza l'chutz. If a leg breaks and the bone sticks out, meaning that it has broken the skin. Im or ubasar choven es rubo. If the skin and the flesh of the animal cover, chovin from chupa, cover the majority of the breakage, mutar, then that, as our Mishnah said, our Mishnah focused on the basar aspect, the flesh, and now we're adding that the or could also be sufficient. Then it's going to be okay, meaning the entire animal is going to be kosher. Imlav asur, but if not, it's going to be prohibited. So, and meaning that the fractured leg itself from that point down will be prohibited. The kamarubo, what does it mean by a majority? So, because you could calculate it in multiple ways. So, ki asa Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So, when Rav Dimi came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rov Ovyo. It means the width of the thickness. Meaning, if you take a look at the breakage and you focus just on the area that is broken, it is the skin over that breakage covered by, if we take a look at the entire uh, opening, right? If you imagine sort of like a cleavage into the bone like this, so then the entire interior surface of the bone that's opened up, that's the thickness of it. And so the question is do you have over it at least 50% of the skin slash flesh coverage of Amrila Rove Hekifo? And some people say no, it's actually 50% of the circumference. And so you don't just focus on the breakage area, but rather at that breakage area, you would look at the entire circumference. And so, ordinarily, I would argue that that would probably be an easier quality to meet because usually where the breakage is, that's the most sensitive spot where there may not be flesh. But in any event, Amarav Papa Hilkach Be'inan Rov of Yo, because we have these two different opinions, and Rov Hekifo. So Rav Papa says, no, you need both. You need both the area, the surface area of the open of the where it's broken on the inside of the animal for it to be covered, and then you also need the circumference around that breakage area to be a majority covered. Okay, so Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, or Harehu Kavasar. Well, we just saw this in this brisa that or ubasar, that the skin and the flesh is going to count towards the majority, whether it's majority covered. And so, what do we see from this? We see, as Ula is quoting Rabbi Yochanan, that skin and flesh are equal. That if you have if you have one or the other covering, that is going to be sufficient if in the aggregate you have sufficient coverage. Amrle Rav Nachman Le'ula, V'lema Mar or Mitztaref Lebasar. Well, maybe it should say that the skin can be added, meaning maybe Daha or Ubasar Katani. Maybe when it says skin and flesh, it means that you can have up to 50% skin, but it's not skin and flesh are fully equal. So Amar Le, Anan or Ova Sartaninan. Well, I learned, Ula explains, in the brisa that we saw, that it wasn't or ubasar or and the skin and flesh or hide and flesh, but rather I saw skin or flesh. And so that's a very big difference. And so as a result, it would be equivalent. Igadamri, there's another view of this discussion that what did Amar Ula, that the Ula said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or mitztaref lebasar, that the or it gets added to the basar, and by that we mean, as Rashi tells us, take a look at Rashi on or Vilema Mar or Mitztaref Basar. What does it mean when we say or it can be added to the Basar? L'chumra duliboy chetzio or bechetzio Basar. It's telling us that you need to have 50% of each. You need to have 50. You can't have more than 50% skin. But obviously you can have the whole thing being flesh, but you can't have less. So you need at least 50% flesh. So maybe, so that's what now, that was the question that, that Rav Nachman asked to Ula in the first approach, and now that's what Ula said in the second approach. So what does Rav Nachman ask in the second approach? Amrle Rav Nachman Ula v'lema mar or mashlim levasar. Maybe it should be that the skin can finish the basar, so it can't lechumra. And so Rashi says, well, lema mar or mashlim lebasar, deliboy rov hakisui bebasar. It's not enough to be 50% flesh. Rather, you need to have a majority basar, umiuta or, and less than half would be skin lehitstaref in order to add to it. Bein shneihem lekisui rov ha'etzem, to use the two of them together to cover half of the bone, to cover the majority of the bone. And so what does Ula say back? Amarlei, ana uvda yadana. I know a situation that supports my read that 50-50 is going to be okay. Dahu bar gozla dahavi be Rabbi Yitzchak. There was a young chick that was, or pigeon that was in the house of Rabbi Yitzchak. Or mitztaref lebasar haba, which was a situation where the skin was added to the meat in a 50-50 situation. So v'asala kamei de Rabbi Yochanan, and it came in front of Rabbi Yochanan v'aksharai, and he said it was kosher. So Amrale, so Rav Nachman says that's not a good proof because Bar Gozla, Kamra, you're talking about a young pigeon. Bar Gozla darakich shiny. A Bar Gozla skin is very soft. That skin is more like flesh than a large animal's hide, which is much tougher, and therefore maybe maybe the skin of a young pigeon would count even if it's an equal amount skin and an equal amount flesh. But maybe when it comes to a larger animal where it has a tough hide, you need to have a majority of flesh and only a minority of skin would be okay. Having mentioned the fact that something that is soft can count as flesh, we now talk about sinews that are covering the breakage. So Hanu Gidin Rakin, excuse me, to Asula Kameh de Rava, and I'll note that it said that the Masoras Hashas changes the Rabbah here throughout to Rava, because in the end we're going to cite a statement of Rava as an effort to contradict, and so as a result, the suggestion is that all of these references should be Rava. And Rashi tells us what do we mean by Durakich? Oro, I'm sorry, Hanu Gidin Harakin. What was that telling us? Havu Mitztaref Labasar, that you had these soft sinews that were added to the flesh, V'chofin Rov Etzem Nishbar, and they were covering a majority of a broken bone. And so that enabled the person to say that this entire leg is going to be kosher if you slaughter the animal. So Amar Rava says, Lamai lechush lahu. Why should we be worried about these sinews? Chada da Amar Rabbi Yochanan. First point is that Rabbi Yochanan's the one who says Gidin Shesofan Lahak, shows that when it comes to sinews that are going to get hard, as we turn to Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, Nimnin Aleim B'Pesach, you can count them towards your Pesach offering, meaning that we need to have, when we have a Pesach offering, and we were at the top of Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, and now looking at Rashi, the top Rashi on Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, Nimnin Aleim, Afilu lo nimna adam im hachabura el lecho mehen yatsa. That when it comes to the Korban Pesach, everybody has to have an olive volume of flesh from that Korban Pesach in order to fulfill their obligation. Well, as a result, you would get large groups of people that would all participate in one Korban Pesach, each of whom would get just an olive's volume of flesh. Well, what if that olive's volume of flesh that you got essentially was primarily these soft sinews? Now they're edible now because they're soft, but they're not really going to be edible long term. If the animal were to get larger and become an adult, they would be not flesh. And so what Rav Yochanan is telling us is that these sinews count as flesh for the Korban Pesach, so that you can add people to your Korban Pesach group. So Yatsa Yadei Achilas Pesach, as we are now in the second line of Rashi on Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. Alma Basar Ninhu. So we see that they're considered flesh. V'od, moreover, HaTorah, back into the Gemara, top line, middle of the line. V'od, another reason that we should say that that these soft sinews should count towards the flesh covering that would make the leg of the animal kosher. HaTorah chasa al mamono shel Yisrael. The Torah is worried about the money belonging to the Jewish people, and so as a result, because of that, we want to, the Torah wants us to be as lenient as possible. So Amrle Rav Papa responded, L'Rava, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. What does that mean? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, meaning that there's some statement by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So take a look back in Rashi, second line of Rashi on Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. Reish Lakish, Palig alei bipsachim. He argues with Rabbi Yochanan in Psachim, B'Ketzat Solin, in the Parak Ketzat Solin on Daf Pei Dalet Amud Aleph. V'Amar Ein Nimnin. We don't allow somebody to be counted based on these sinews that are soft now but are going to be hard later. V'hacha la'achshure treifa, and moreover, when it comes to saying that a treifa is kosher, ka'asi, that's what you're trying to do. V'isura de'oraisahi, and that is, as we're going to read in the next words in the Gemara, that is a biblical prohibition. V'atamat. And so that's going to be the question. So let's jump back into the Gemara. Third line on Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, back in the Gemara. V'isura da'oraisa, v'at amrat my lechushlu. We're talking about a biblical prohibition, and you're telling me what should we be concerned about? We should be concerned about violating a Torah prohibition. Ishtik. And so Rava was quiet. V'amai ishtek. 1 second, though, the Gemara wonders why should he be quiet. V'amar Rava. Rava himself is the one who says, and this is why we change the girsa from Rabba to Rava. Hilchasa kavasik to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish bahani tlas. That there are only 3 areas where the halacha is like Reish Lakish. In general, we paskin Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, if we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, we would paskin like Rabbi Yochanan here because this isn't one of the 3 exceptions. And so as a result, Rava would seem to have an awesome response. So no, there's a reason that he couldn't respond that way. Shiny Hacha. This case is different. Dahadar. Rabbi Yochanan Lagabi to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that Rabbi Yochanan actually changed his opinion and switched it to the opinion of Reish Lakish, of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Da'amar lei, as we are going to see in the 9th chapter of this Masechet, that Rabbi Yochanan is going to say in response to a question by Reish Lakish, Al taknik teni b'lashon yachid. Don't bother me about don't bother me about this language that you're citing from a particular Mishnah. That Mishnah is the opinion of an individual. Ani shona ota. I'm sorry. B'lashon yachid ani shona ota. I learned that opinion as a singular, meaning that that's a singular viewpoint. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi helps us understand what's going on here. It's from the top of the narrow lines of Rashi. It's 15 lines down, maybe 16 lines down. De Amrle, Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say to Reish Lakish, B'ha'or Ba'arotev, that's the 9th chapter of this Masechet. De Kiboy Mineh, because Reish Lakish had asked him, or Harosh shall Egel Harach. If you have Mahu, if you have the skin of the head of a calf that is very soft, so the skin is very supple, Sheyitma, does it become Tameh because it's effectively still edible? V'Amrlei, and he said, and Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan responded to Reish Lakish, Eino Mitame. No, it is not going to be Tameh as food. Because in the end it will get hard. It will be tough skin. And so what do we see from this? We see that if something is soft now but will become tough later, Rabbi Yochanan will tell us that it in fact is tough, and that shows that in fact he must have changed his opinion in Psachim, because there he was saying that the soft sinews were counted as meat, and even though they were going to turn hard. And so as a result, this shows that Rabbi Yochanan must have changed his opinion. And now, and in our discussion that we'll have later in this Maseches, Reish Lakish says back to Rabbi Yochanan, Harei Shaninu, but 1 second, we learned in a Mishnah, Ve'elu Sha'oroseihen Kibesaran. These are the situations where the animal's hide is treated like it's meat, or haroshal egel arach, and one of them was this case. So so as a result, and of course that would be the support for Rabbi Yochanan saying in Psachim that soft sinews are like flesh. But Amar Lei, and so Rabbi Yochanan responded, that Mishnah that you're citing, Al taknikeni ba b'lo yachidani shonauta. Well, I learned that Mishnah as having been taught by a single person. Kolomer yichidahi. It's an individual's view. V'lo sviralan kvase, and I don't agree with it. And so that shows that really Rabbi Yochanan changed his viewpoint and went with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And so as a result, that's why Rava couldn't say, hey, I'm holding like Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan no longer held his position. So in the end, it seems like Rav Papa's question was a really good question. So another story. Hahun nishbar ha'etzem v'yatzalachutz. There was a situation where the bone broke and it stuck out of the skin, meaning it broke through the skin. The ishtakel kurtisa mine, and a chip of that bone fell off. So Asala Kamei de Abaye. It was brought in front of Abaye. Shahaya Tulasa Rigle. He waited for 3 festivals to discuss it with the rabbis that would come up for the festival periods, but he wasn't able to come to any conclusion. So Amrle Rav Ada Bar Masna. So Rav Ada Bar Masna says, and Rashi explains, Libal HaBehema, he says to the owner of the animal, Zil Kamei de Rava, go in front of Rava, Braid de Rav Yosef Bar Chama, to Rava the son of Rav Yosef Bar Chama, to Charifa Sakine, as we would say today, he's got a sharp mind. Here, the literal translation is his knife is sharp, but it's essentially a phraseology that means he's a very smart guy. So Asla Kameh, he went in front of Rava, Amar, and he said, Michti, let's take a look. Nishbara etzem v'yatzalachutz tnan. We have in a brisa that, in fact, if the bone is broken and it goes outside, that as long as you have a majority of skin covered, majority of flesh and skin covering it, you're going to be okay. So what doesn't it say anything about? Mali nafal, mali isay. Who cares whether a chip of the bone fell out when it was outside the body? That isn't what's important. What's important is whether or not there is sufficient coverage. And so as a result, as Rashi tells us, Michti nishbar ha'etzem v'yatzu tanan. We're now looking up from the bottom of Rashi. It's 9, 12, 15, 18 lines up. Michti nishbar ha'etzem v'yatzu tanan. Bebraisa deleel, the brisa that we cited earlier, mali nafal minei, mali isei. What do I care whether a piece of that bone falls out or if it's still here? Ha'il v'or ubasar chofen es rubo kshera. As long as the skin and flesh are covering a majority, it's going to be kosher. So, Amar le Ravina l'Rava. Now we have a series of questions. My apologies for not scrolling. We now have a series of questions that are going to get asked. We are only going to address the last one. And so it's not clear what the answer would be in all of the others. Presumably, we would need to be strict. Mislaket mahu. What happens if you had to add together? Now, because these are words that are not particularly clear, it's worthwhile to keep a finger on Rashi. So 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 lines up in Rashi. 15 lines up in Rashi. Mislaket mahu. Basar hanosar, the lekasos harov, eno yachad, that the meat, the flesh that is sufficient, that is extra, that is enabling us to say that a majority of the flesh is covering the bone. It's not all connected flesh. Elakan ma'at, ukan ma'at, a little bit is here, a little bit is there. Saviv ha'etzem, all around the bone. And so as a result, and it may be that some of those skins are not touching anything else. It's just sort of like even potentially hanging on the bone. So im titztra fehu hare rov hekifa nechasa. That if in fact we can count all these different pieces, then you would have a majority covered. So, but what's the law in that situation? Is that considered a majority? Or do we say, no, you can't count pieces that aren't attached to one another? Mitroses, next Rashi, Mahu. What if it's mitroses? Mitroses, Rashi tells us, Shahaya habasar miroded. The meat, the flesh over the coverage is flattened. And so maybe it's only because it's been flattened that it is now covering a majority of the space. The kalush, the chupa es rov ha'etzem. And so it's spread out and it now covers the majority. Does that count? Because if you accumulated it back up to where it was, maybe it wouldn't cover a majority. Mitmasmes mahu. What if it has decayed? And so as a result, there's a problem with it. So, and with Heki Dami Mismat says, what the Gemara, we're now back in the Gemara. The Gemara says, what does it mean to have decayed? Amar Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yoshua, Kol Rofe Kodro. Anytime an animal doctor, a veterinarian, would say that you need to cut away the flesh because it's decayed, that would be a situation where we treat it as decayed. So what if that is creating us the majority? Ibailahu, more questions. Nikav mahu, what if there's a hole in it? And even though and even though a majority is still covered, you still have a hole within the flesh, and so maybe we should not include all of that flesh. Niklaf mahu, or what if it peeled away from the bone, and so as a result, it's not directly connected to the bone. Nistak mahu, what if it's split? Hard to understand how this is different from mislake, the situation, but what if it's split? So, meaning, that there's uh, here this is suggesting that maybe some of it is here, some of it may be missing, whereas none of it was missing in the situation where you add it all together. So nital shlish hatachton mahu. What if the bottom third is missing, so that there's essentially a space between the breakage and the breakage and the skin and the flesh above it. So Tashma, well, on that one, maybe we have an answer. Da'amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan or Harehu Kivasar. We saw that Ula said that the skin is like the flesh. And so as a result, if skin is like the flesh, as Rashi explains, Tashma, Chada Mehanach Boy Da'amar Rabbi Yochanan or Hari Da'amar, I'm sorry, we're going to be able to answer one of these questions. We're in the top line of the wide lines on Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph in the Rashi. That we can answer one of the questions. Da'amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, right, we're quoting Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or Harehu Kabasar, that the skin is just like flesh. So what do we see? Alma nital shlish hatachton. So if you remove the bottom third of the flesh, the nishar or ushnei shlishi, and you leave the skin along with 2/3 of the thickness of the flesh, omdin, and that's still left. Kol shekain to kosher. It should certainly be kosher. Meaning, if we're going to understand Rabbi Yochanan's statement, and we're going to change our understanding in a moment, but if we understand Rabbi Yochanan's statement to say, look, if you have a breakage out of the skin, and you have most of the broken bone is still covered by skin, even though there's no flesh below it, that's sufficient. Well, then certainly if there's flesh below it, it should be sufficient to constitute a majority of the coverage. So not necessarily, because Dilma dekana mashkadide. Maybe when Rabbi Yochanan said that the skin can count, it's only when the skin is attached to the bone. But when the skin is separate from the bone, and as is the case here, where there's a separation between the breakage and the bone and the flesh/skin, maybe that wouldn't be sufficient. So Amar of Ashi Kiavinin Be Rav Papi Iboilan. When we were in Rav Papi's yeshiva, we asked the question: Nikdar kamin tabas mahu. What if you had a cutout that was separating the flesh from the breakage that was like a ring? So there was airspace. Well, that's very similar to our question about the bottom 1/3 being removed. And so as a result, the upashtana, and we answered that question, Miha, da Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. We answered that from a statement by Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Davar zeh sha'alti l'chachamim v'lerofin. That Rav Yehuda said, that Rav said that he had asked the chachamim and the doctors, V'amru misartu be'etzem umala aruka, that if you scratch flesh with bone, it will regenerate. Aval parzala, but if you mizraf zarif, but if you use metal, so then it will abrade and will not regenerate. And so here, where there's a ring that is missing, it was involved in a bone damaging situation. And so the bone is what's essentially scraped it. So as a result, that's going to be okay, even when there's a ring of flesh missing. Rav Papa. Rav Papa said that's not always true. V'hu dekana garma didei. That is where, however, you need to have that the bone and the flesh have already become somewhat connected to one another. So as a result, if you have a ring of flesh being missing around a breakage, you need to effectively wait in order to determine whether or not the bone will take hold of the skin. And if it does, then it will start making new flesh, and everything will be okay. And it will and it will regenerate, and therefore it will not be considered a breakage that is problematic. Okay, so now we go back to our discussion. We leave the discussion of treifa and breakages, and go back to our discussion of pregnancy and the results. So hashochet es habehema umatzava shilya. If you slaughter an animal and you find in it an amniotic sac, so nefesh hayafa tochlena. Well, like we saw, that if it's still inside the mother, then it's edible. And so as a result, you can potentially eat it as long as you don't. My apologies, I got disconnected. I'm back on. How
Mm.
much did I miss? How
Just a few seconds. I wasn't sure if it was you
No,
or
it's
me.
definitely me, definitely me. So let's back up and we'll go back to the top of the Mishnah. That will be sufficient if we go back to the top of the Mishnah. Okay, so Hashochet es a behema umatzav shilya. So again, our Mishnah on the bottom of Ayin Zayin and Aleph says that if you slaughter an animal and you find inside it, it's the amniotic sac of indicating that it was pregnant. Nevesh hayafa tochlena. If you're able to, so then you can eat the amniotic sac. Because you slaughtered the animal, and so as a result, the amniotic sac, like other things that are left over from the infant, if, for example, we saw earlier in the chapter that if the entire infant is kosher, ve'ena mitama, and it won't convey tuma. It's not going to be tame like a nevela, lo tuma Oakland, it's not going to convey tuma of foods, meaning that it's not considered a food ordinarily, below tumas nevelos, and it's not considered a nevela. And Rashi points out, explaining to us, lo tumas nevelos, imesa habema, meaning even if the mother animal had not been slaughtered, but had just died of natural causes, this um, um, amniotic sac would not constitute a nevela because it is not part of the mother and therefore and doesn't have any bone and sinew structure to it. However, if you think that you're going to eat it, now all of a sudden it becomes food. So as a result, mitama tumas ochlin, it becomes food. Avalo tumas nevelos, but it still won't be tame like a nevela. Why not? Rashi tells us about lo tumas nevelos dela basarhu, because it is not considered flesh. Ela kashar ochel ba'almahu. In order for the a nevela, in order for a dead animal to convey tuma, you need it to have flesh that's associated with it, and this amniotic sac is not considered flesh. So never mind the piece about the bones and the sinews that I mentioned. The key is that it's not considered to be actual meat. So shilya sheyat some miktasa, if part of the amniotic sac emerged from the animal and then it was slaughtered, well then asura ba'achila, then that part that is prohibited to eat. Simin vlad be'isha, because it's an indication that there was some kind of childbirth, whether it's for a woman, b'simin vlad b'behema, and it's also a sign for an animal that there was some kind of birth that happened. So as a result, because there was a birth that actually happened. Now and because that's the indication of the amniotic sac emerging from either the woman or the animal, it's now no longer going to be covered. The entire amniotic sac is no longer going to be covered by the slaughtering of the mother in terms of when we're talking about an animal. So if it's the firstborn of the animal and it has an amniotic sac that comes out, you can throw it to the dogs. Now, why don't we treat it as if it is a Bechor? So Yashlichenu leklavim, end of the line, 7 lines up in Rashi. Yashlichenu leklavim she'ein ba kedusha. There's no holiness for it. Ta'afal gav de'ein shilya below Vlad. Even though we know that must have been some kind of birth here. Hacha ruba lav bas mikudsha mikdisha. Most of the births are not going to result in any kind of sanctification. The Dilma Nekeva Hava, because maybe, as we will see later on in the Gemara, maybe it's a female child. Kedila Kaman Gemara, and maybe it's not even a child at all. And so we'll see that there's no, that as a result, it's not considered Kodesh, and therefore you would be able to throw it away. Ubimukdashin, but when it comes to sacrifices, then to cover, then you would need to bury it, because whether the child was male or female, it would have a sense of holiness. And so as a result, the majority of births would result in the holiness of the child, and therefore the amniotic sac, and therefore that amniotic sac needs to be buried and cannot be thrown to the dogs. You're not allowed to benefit from it. Ein kover nosa b'farashat drachim. You can't bury it at the fork in the road, where the road separates. Ein tolenota be'ilan. You can't hang it from a tree. Mibnei darchei hamori, because these are the ways of the Amorites. And Rashi points out b'farashat drachim. 1, 2, 3, 5 lines up, end of the line, now beginning of the 4th to last line on Rashi. Mokum shadrachim is parashim, where the road separates l'shnaim into 2 places, so that's essentially the fork in the road. Derech hamenachshim, and those who were superstitious would lekovrasham, would bury there shalot tapil ot, so that they not have any more miscarriages. And so the point is that we don't believe in superstition, and so we need to avoid superstition. And so we will get back to this concept of superstition in a moment as we end of the day today. So Minahani Mili, how do I know that in fact you can eat this, that you can eat the amniotic sac inside, and that if it emerges, you can't eat it? To Tana Rabbanan, because we have a brisa, Kol behema tochelu. Everything in an animal you can eat. This is Dvarim Perek Yudalid Pasuk Vav, where it says, V'chol behema mafrezes parsa v'shosa shesa. So it's got to have split hooves and chew its cuds. Shtei prasot, it's got to have split hooves into 2 full separate. Malas geira, and eat and chew its cud. Behema ota tochelu. That among the animals, that's what you can eat. So what does that tell us? L'rabos kol, the fact that it says any animal, l'rabos is a shilya. It comes to include the amniotic sac included inside the mother. I might have thought that even if it some partially got emerged, then it would be problematic. Talmud lomar ota, the animal itself you can eat. Ota v'lo shilyata. You can't always eat its amniotic sac. So when the amniotic sac emerges, then it's not kosher. But as long as it's inside, then it is kosher. Michti, ein shilya below vlad. Now you said that there was no amniotic sac without a child. So lama likra. Well, why do I need any kind of verse? Meaning, it would be obvious that we can't do this, as Rashi tells us. Lama likra l'meimer v'lo shel yasa. That if it why do I need a pasuk to tell us that you cannot eat the shilya if it emerges? Pshita de asura. It's obvious that it's going to be prohibited. Deshema yatsa havlan, because when the amniotic sac is no longer inside the mother, it's an indication that possibly there was a child. And in fact, we say that anytime there is an amniotic sac, there was a child. V'harehu kiyilud. And so as a result, it is if this animal gave birth. Vishilya basrei azla. And the amniotic sac follows the status of the fetus itself. The lo shariza shkita. And so as a result, if the amniotic sac follows the status of the child has emerged. So as a result, when the mother now gets slaughtered, even though part of that amniotic sac is inside her, the amniotic sac follows the status of the child. The child is obviously not slaughtered when the mother is slaughtered because the child is no longer inside the mother. And so as a result, the shita, of course, does not work for the amniotic sac because just as it doesn't work for the child. So lama likra, why do I need this verse at all? Back into the Gemara, kra asmachta ba'alma. No, really, the pasuk is just there as as support. It is not actually the definitive proof, and we actually learned something else from that pasuk. Indeed, that pasuk is the pasuk that teaches us that if you cut from the mother the mother's spleen or kidney and you leave it inside, then that is going to be prohibited. And so that's what we learned from that. We saw that in the very first Mishnah of our chapter. Ve'enu mitama, and then we said that this amniotic sac does not convey tuma and is not subject to becoming tameh like food. So boy Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachor, he asked, or chamor shishlako mahu. What if you have the hide of a donkey that has been very well cooked, so it's now actually soft and therefore edible? Of course, it's not kosher, but it's edible. So do we say that that edible aspect of it now makes it like food so that it lamai? So what are we asking about? What meaning what are you asking about? Lutumas ochlin, if you're telling me, well, is it considered like food that it could become tame like food? So Tanina, we actually have a brisa that says, of course, the answer is yes. And ilutumas nevelos, and if you're asking whether now it's considered like flesh, so that if it had died ordinarily, Tanina, we also learned it. And so as a result, we have we don't understand what your question's about. And how do I know about Tumas Ochlin? Now we're on the Ayin Zayin bet. Titania, because we have the Brisa, Ha'or v'Hashilya. If you have the hide and the amniotic sac of an animal, Ein Mitam and Tumas Ochlin, they will not become tummy because of food, because they're not food, they're not edible. Or shishlako, but if you have the skin, and you cook it really well, or you're not disgusted by eating the amniotic sac and you think that you're going to eat it, well now mitamin tumas ochlin, now it becomes tame as a result of food. So the same thing should be true for this hide of a donkey. So tumas nevelus namitanina, and we have the halacha associated with Tuma Nevela as well. Binivlasa, that when the Torah tells us, this is a pasuk, Vayikra Parak Yud Aleph pasuk Lametet, V'chiyamut min habehima asher hi lachem le'ochla, Hanogea benivlasa yitma ad ha'arav. So why does it say Hanogea benivlasa? It could have just said Hanogea ba. What is benivlasa? It says v'lo ba'or. It means the carcass itself, the meat itself. You do not become tameh from a nevela by touching the hide. V'lo ba'atzamot, and not by touching bones, v'lo b'gidin, and not by touching sinews, v'lo b'karnayim, and not by touching horns, v'lo b'tlafim, and not by touching hooves. V'amar Rabba bar Rav Chana, lo nitzrucha elasha asa'an sike kedera, that it's only when the exclusion of these things, we only need them when you're using them as a spice to cook. So as a result of, ordinarily, of course they're not going to be tummy. But even if you use them as a spice, as some kind of flesh here, then it's not going to. Still not going to be. It's still not going to be subject to tumas nevela. So as a result, what is Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachman's question? Again, when it comes to the cooked hide, it should be subject to tuma of foods. And when it comes to the tumas nevela, even if you cook it really well, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be tummy of a nevela. So la'olam tumas ochlin. Really, we're asking about tumas ochlin. And why is it that the brisa that we cited earlier does not answer the question for us? Because that brisa is talking about regular animals, v'shiny or chamor, and the hide of a donkey is different. Demise, it's very disgusting. So while the hide of another animal will turn into food if you cook it really well and it becomes nice and soft, maybe you would say something different with respect to the hide of a donkey because it's disgusting. And we do not actually answer, interestingly enough, the Rav Yitzchak Bar Nafcha's question. So Shilya Shiyatsa, if we had the amniotic sac emerge, we said Amar Rabbi Elazar. We said that in that situation, that amniotic sac is not going to be kosher, and it is a sign that there was a birth. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Lo Shanu Ela She'ein Imavlad. It's important to note that we're assuming that there was no fetus that was seen with the amniotic sac. Aval yeshima vlad, but if there was a fetus that was seen and the fetus is still inside the mother, ein choshishin livlad acher. We're not going to worry about another child, and we're going to say that this amniotic sac was the amniotic sac that was around this fetus that's still inside the mother, and it just got ejected because we have an easy explanation. There's one amniotic sac, one fetus. We'll just say that the amniotic sac came from that fetus, even though it's now partially outside the mother. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says, Bain ein ima vlad, bain yesh ima vlad, koshishin livlad acher. Doesn't make a difference whether or not the amniotic sac, whether there's a fetus present inside the mother or not. We are always going to be worried that this amniotic sac that is partially outside the mother is from a birth that is no longer inside the mother. Heini, is that really so? Because V'ha'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, l'chumra amra Rabbi Elazar. 1 second. Rabbi Yirmiyah said that Rabbi Elazar's statement was more machmir than Rabbi Yochanan. But as we just recorded the two viewpoints, Rabbi Yochanan is more stringent because he's the one who says, who cares whether there's a vlad here? We're always going to treat the amniotic sac as not kosher. And therefore, because we're going to always assume that there was a child that came out, and the amniotic sac will follow the child that came out, and therefore not be kosher, even when you slaughter the mother. So rather, we got to revisit the statements of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan, and here's what was said. Amar Rabbi Elazar lo shanu ela she'ein kshura bivlad. No, the key question is the amniotic sac connected to the mother? If the amniotic sac is connected to the mother, then we're going to treat that amniotic sac, connected to the fetus. If that amniotic sac is still connected to the fetus inside the mother, well, then we'll treat it like it's still inside. Aval kshura b'vlad. But if it, I'm sorry, my apologies. I said, Lo shanu ela she'ena kshura v'lad. When do we say that the amniotic sac is not going to be kosher because it exited? That's where it's no longer attached to a fetus that's still inside its mother. But if it's still attached to a fetus inside the mother, so that then it's not going to be considered as if it came out. And ein kosher shin v'lad acher, because it's connected to that fetus that's still inside the mother, we'll assume that this is the amniotic sac for that fetus. However, if the amniotic sac was no longer attached to the fetus, well, then we'll be concerned about there having been another birth, and therefore Rabbi Elazar would say that's the situation that we're going to say that the amniotic sac is not kosher in our Mishnah. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, anu ein lanu ela shilya below vlad. The only situation where we're going to worry about a birth that happened is if there's no other fetus present in the mother. Aval yeshim avlad, if there is a fetus inside the mother, bein kshur b'vlad, bein ein kshur b'vlad, ein chosher shen v'lad acher. We're not going to worry about another child because we only have one amniotic sac. We have one fetus. We're just going to assume that they were connected to each other, even if they're no longer connected at this moment. So as a result, now we see that Rebbe Elazar is the more strict view, because Rebbe Elazar says that we'll only allow this amniotic sac if there's still an attachment between the amniotic sac and the fetus. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, as long as we know that there's only one fetus and it's still inside the mother, and one amniotic sac, even if it's partially outside the mother, we will allow everything to go after the mother. And so as a result, the part of the amniotic sac that's outside the mother certainly won't be kosher. But the part of the amniotic sac that's still inside the mother it, like the fetus itself, will all be considered slaughtered, just like the mother's been slaughtered. V'hainu dam Rabbi Yirmiyah, and that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah said. L'chumra amra Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar's statement was the one that's more stringent. Tanya kavazi to Rabbi Elazar, and you know what? We have a brisa that teaches exactly like Rabbi Elazar. Hamapelet, when it comes to a woman who's having a baby, min behema chayav, but unfortunately she has a miscarriage, and what comes out does not look like a child. Rather, it looks like an animal, a behema chaya or a bird. So the shilya imahen and the amniotic sac comes out with them. So bisman shikshura behen, when the amniotic sac is attached to the animal, to the birth, the miscarriage, well then choshishin levladachad. We're gonna ain choshishin levladacher, excuse me. Then we're not going to worry that there was another child, because we're going to assume that the amniotic sac and this miscarriage that we see that looks like an animal were both together. It's all one, and therefore we're going to treat this as if, because the halakha is that if the miscarriage does not look like a human child, there is no tuma that's associated with it, and so as a result, she's not tameh for any set period, like a male child or a female child. It's just a miscarriage, and therefore, as soon as she stops bleeding, she can go to the mikveh and be back together with her husband. Ein kshur behen. However, if the amniotic sac and the miscarriage that looks like an animal is not attached, well, now we have to be worried that the amniotic sac was not associated with this animal-looking miscarriage, but rather with another valid child. And so, so we have to put on her two stringencies. One, the stringency associated with only having an animal-looking miscarriage, which means that you don't get any benefit of pure days or any disadvantage of impure days, and we have to put on her the disadvantages of having miscarried a female child, which is a miscarriage that triggers a 14-day tuma period, ordinarily it would be followed by a 66-day tahara period. But in this case, because we also have to be worried that maybe there was no other child, she gets the 14 days of tuma and 0 days of tahara. And so as a result, even if she bleeds 1 day after the 14-day period of tuma, she is going to still have to wait the full tuma period associated with that bleeding, because shema nimucha shel yasa shel shapir. Shani omer. I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit. Shani omer shema nimuach shapir shel shilya, because I have to worry that maybe the miscarried fetus that's associated with the amniotic sac has disappeared from us. It's dissolved, and maybe the amniotic sac of the animal-looking miscarriage, shema nimucho shel yaso shel shapir, and the amniotic sac of the embryo that we have, namely the animal-looking embryo, that also dissolved. And so as a result, we're going to say that we're worried that there might have been two births. Okay, so so we said if there's a first carrying animal and this fetus is miscarried, so we're going to have to you can throw it to the dogs, and so because we're not worried that actually maybe it was a male miscarriage, and therefore this amniotic sac should be considered holy as a bechor. Well, my taima, why don't we worry about that? So Rav Ika Breda Rav Ami. Rav Ika explained in the name of Rav Ami, Rov behemos yoldos davar hakadosh bevechora. Most births have a child that could potentially be subject to a bechor, meaning that it looks like an animal. Umiyut, but a minority, behemos davar she'ena kadosh b'chora. But a minority, even if it's male, it won't be considered sanctified because it doesn't look like the mother. Because there's a rule. Umay nihu. What is it that we're talking about? Nidme. It's where it looks like a different animal. If you have a cow that is giving birth, and what comes out is a male a male goat, then even though it's the first birth of this cow, since it looks like a male goat, it is not considered a bechor animal. And in addition, so that's one thing to know. V'chol hayoldos, yoldos, mechzas charim, mechzas negevos. And all regular births, if you have a normal child, it's about 50-50, half male, half female. So samuch miuta denidme lemechzas negevos. So you add the small probability of a non similar looking animal, meaning that it looks like a different animal, to the 50-50 that is female, v'havulahu zcharim miuta. And now if you take a look at all childbirths, less than half are going to be male. And therefore, we're going to say that this is probably not from a male child, and therefore the amniotic sac can be benefited from because there's a better than a 50-50 chance that it is not from a Bechor animal that would have holiness of a Bechor. To kaver, and we say that when it comes to an animal that's consecrated as a sacrifice, that if the amniotic sac does need to be thrown away, well, my timer, why does it need to be thrown away? What about all this logic that we just had? Maybe we could use a similar logic to say that it shouldn't be kodesh. No, Ruba bar mikdashu. Most of the children that this animal would have sanctity. Now, it is true, Rashi points out, that if it was a nidmeh, if it would look like a different animal, it would not have sanctity because the only child it has is a normal child, not a deformed child. And so as a result, but if you look at what's most likely, as Rashi says, 4 lines up, Bein Zachar, Bein Nekeva, you have both the male and the female. That's a lot more likely. Chutz min nidbeh. The only exception is that when it looks like a different animal. Finally, we said ein kovernota. You can't bury it at the fork of a road or hang it on a tree. Abaye v'Rava de Amrei Tarbayu. Abaye and Rava both say, even though they often argue, here they agree. Kol davar sheyesh bo refuah. Anything that has some kind of healing aspect to it. Ein bo mishum darkei omri. You don't need to worry about following the way of the Amorites. Meaning, if everybody's taking medication that works on healing you in a particular way, you can do it. Ein bo refuah. However, if there is no healing, yesh bo mishum darkei amor. Well, then you have to be worried about following their paths. So take a look at Rashi. Rashi explains it nicely. Yesh bo mishum refuah, 3rd line up from the bottom of Rashi. Kagon mashke. If you have some drink, osam, or some compound, lachash shalochash alamaka, or some ointment that you put on the wound. If all of them work, if there is some benefit, healing benefit to them, they don't count as superstition. Ein bo mishum refuah, but if they don't have any kind of healing, for example, if you do something not on the person who's ill at all, so the mechanism of healing is to put a bandage on the mother's, on the, mother's brother or something, could go, and now the example that's relevant here is could go kfura shilya, like the burial of the amniotic sac. That you're not doing anything to the mother, you're burying the amniotic sac. B'prashas hadrakim, in the fork in the road, the kiyotzeben, and anything like that should domin l'nichush. It seems like superstition, so that's all going to be problematic. Ooh, and I just realized that I didn't reshare my screen, so let me reshare my screen. I'll then scroll through it so that people can see where we're up to and what we've done. So pause it a couple of times. Okay, and so as we now turn, so that's the statement of Abaye and Rav. Basically, do we have some healing? If yes, don't worry about superstition. If there's no healing value, well, then you got to worry about superstition, and you don't do things that are just superstitious. But Tanya, but 1 second, I'll show you. We have a brisa that seems to be very heavily superstitious. Ilan shemasher perusav. If you have a tree that had produced its fruits very quickly and too early, and therefore it wasn't really good fruit, sokro besikra v'toano ba'avanim. You can dye it red, and you can hang rocks from it. So bishlamatona ba'avanim. Listen, I understand why you might want to hang rocks from it because kihechi, as we turn to the top of Ayin Chem and Aleph, denichuche chele. Because that way you can weaken its strength. Because what is the concern is why did these trees produce their fruit so quickly? It's such a strong tree that it was like throwing out the fruit. And so as a result, you weaken the tree, and now it's going to hold on to the fruit a little longer. Ella socro besikra. But when it comes to dyeing it with red pigment, why would that be permitted? How could that be of any value? And again, note here that when we say refuah, we don't mean only refuah to humans. This is highlighting that the refuah could be, you mean you're not actually fixing something with respect to the tree. No, no, the point is that when you have, if we all know that a red tree means that the tree has not been successful at producing, then people will see the tree and be able to pray that in fact this tree should now produce next year in a nice way. Kedetanya, and we have an example of this in the Torah itself. V'tamei tamei yikra, that when we have a mitzorah, he's supposed to call out, I'm tamei, I'm tamei. Tzorich lahodia l'rabim. He needs to tell everybody in the public. The rabbim mivakshim alav rachamim. Why does he need to tell everybody? Because everybody should be davening on his behalf that he should have that God should have mercy on him. And so similarly, if something bad happens to someone, they should also you need to tell people the rabbim mevakshim alav rachamim so that people can pray for you. And so it's a very important lesson that sometimes we need to share the difficult things that happen to us, and it will unburden us. Indeed, sometimes just sharing it will make us feel better. But it's very important to unburden ourselves and to enable others to help us and potentially daven on our behalf. And that in and of itself is not considered superstitious. That's considered consistent with Judaism. Amaravina, Kaman Talinan, Kufsa Bedikla. So what is the proof, or how do I know, or how, according to whom do we hang dates on a palm tree? And Rashi tells us kuvsa eshkol tamarim, a group of dates, a cluster of dates, the simanhu, and it's a sign shemashir perusav, that this tree produced its fruits too quickly. So kaman, who is that like? Ki hai Tana, like the Tana of the Brisa that we cited with the respect to the red pigment and the hanging the rocks, that the red pigment is just like hanging a cluster of dates. So hadron alach behema hamaksha, hadron alach behema hamaksha, hadron alach behema hamaksha. And so God willing, we will pick up with the fifth parak of Masechet Chullin, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together. My apologies for my connections issues. Looking forward to our learning tomorrow.